All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being out here today, and for your patience as we are starting a few minutes late. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF. I'd like to welcome you to today's event on the value of facial recognition in law enforcement. So first, a few logistics. The event is being recorded and webcast. If you're watching online or if you're in the room and you want to tweet, we're using the hashtag ITIF facial recognition. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Since we're starting about 15 minutes late, we're probably going to go maybe 10 minutes over, but we'll save plenty of time for questions since we have a full room. So first of all, the goal of today's events is to discuss the opportunities for law enforcement to use facial recognition technology. Right now we're seeing it being used as a tool for investigations to solve crimes. We're seeing it used as a security countermeasure in schools and airports and other public venues, and as a means to securely identify individuals at ports of entry. But the benefits aren't well understood by the public. At the same time, over the past few months, some of the loudest opposition to facial recognition, particularly government use of facial recognition, has received significant media attention. And these objections are not new. Many of the groups that have been opposing facial recognition now have been actively opposing it over the past 20 years. And before that, they were opposed to security cameras and license plate readers and red light cameras and fingerprint databases, and the list kind of keeps going on and on. So some of this opposition is to be expected. But there's also, I think, something about facial recognition that has, at this moment, captured the public imagination. And so part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that the newest versions of facial recognition are using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this is a technology that both frightens and fascinates a lot of people. Part of this has to do with the fact that there's a growing techlash, and there's a lot of suspicion about tech companies and suspicion about technological innovation overall. And part of this also has to do with the hostility that we do see towards public law enforcement. So I think in this environment, facial recognition faces an uphill battle for public acceptance. But it's really important for us to have this conversation. It's important that the public understands the potential benefits of the technology so that law enforcement can have these tools and use them to do their jobs effectively and safely. And I think one fact that always kind of amazes me is that residents make enormous demands on law enforcement. We want them to be able to fix problems of all types quickly, cheaply, and without error. But if we expect law enforcement to meet the needs of our communities, they have to have the best available tools. And for facial recognition, we see this kind of clearly in some of these high-risk scenarios. When you're trying to identify an active shooter or a bombing suspect. But I suspect that for many residents, they're actually going to recognize the need for some of this technology, even in those more routine interactions that most people are likely to have with police. So for example, when someone calls to report that somebody's broken into their car or somebody's stolen an Amazon package off their front porch, they usually have a photo now and they want to give it to the police and they want the police to do something with it. And this is where I think we need to make sure that police also have the technology in hand so they can be responsive to their community needs. So the goal of our conversation today is to better understand the opportunities for facial recognition use in law enforcement, the ways that agencies are adjusting the challenges they face, and what the future might hold for this technology. So I'm delighted that we have such a great set of panelists and experts here with me today. There's one face up here that I don't recognize, so I will allow her to introduce herself momentarily. But starting on the far end, we have Eddie Reyes, Director of the Office of Public Safety and Communications in Prince William County Police Department. To his right, Benji Hutchinson, the Vice President of Federal Operations for NEC. Michael Hardin, Director of Policy for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And then we had Jim Birch, who's the President of the National Police Foundation. He left a few minutes ago because of the incident we had earlier today. So I suspect in his place we have somebody joining us new.
Yes, hi. My name's Maureen McGough. I'm Director of National Programs at the National Police Foundation. Thanks for having us.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us and stepping in at the last minute for us. So let me just start off with, I think one of the most important questions here. What are the main uses for facial recognition in law enforcement today? What are the primary opportunities that we should be focusing on? Eddie, let me start with you. I want everyone on the panel to take this one.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Well, just to put my responses into perspective, I'll be answering as a 26-year veteran of law enforcement, having retired as a number 2 guy at Alexandria Police a few years ago, and then also as the chairman of the ICP's Communications and Technology Committee, where we pretty much review all things communications and technology related for police chiefs around the world. Facial recognition, what I like to call is photo recognition, is really starting to pick up in the mainstream of law enforcement because of all the reasons that you said earlier, Dan. I mean, if you're the victim of a crime, especially a violent crime, you would like that person apprehended immediately. And in today's world where almost everyone has a camera, whether it's on their property or on their person, the availability of cameras and photos is readily available. And unfortunately, because of some of the limitations that we've been witnessing around the country, unfortunately, law enforcement agencies have to do a painstaking search of person by person as opposed to automating that capability and expediting the identification of a photograph that best matches that suspect. Obviously, it has to be done right. There has to be proper policy. There has to be proper training. There has to be proper oversight of such a program. But if all those measures are in place, photo recognition technology could be an outstanding tool to law enforcement.
Great, thanks. Benji, I mean, you're seeing this kind of firsthand as obviously one of the technology providers, and you're seeing both what your company's doing as well as competitors in this field, and you're seeing the adoption. Can you talk about what you see as the opportunity?
Sure. I mean, you were talking about some of the use cases, and there are so many, right? I mean, IACP and I just put out a document about this very topic, right? How the various ways that law enforcement can use the technology, and we're seeing it all across the country. We're seeing it all around the world, right? And so it is the time for the maturation of the technology. It's not a new technology. It's something that's been around for quite a while, going on 20 years. The automated ways that it works have been around for that long. NIST has been testing it since the late 90s. So that's another thing that people forget. But as far as the use cases go, developing investigatory leads is the primary way that law enforcement uses it today. If you have a 2D photo and you want to search that against a mugshot database to develop leads, and what's also important to remember is that when these police officers are using this technology, they're developing candidate lists. So, one of the myths out there is that there's a match and there's this positive action that happens immediately afterwards. It's just not the case, right? It's an investigatory lead. They go and they do the hard police work, and they use those leads to help solve crimes. We're also seeing it in ways that folks may not think of, which is family reunification, trying to match these photos for people that have been kidnapped, children have been kidnapped. We're seeing it in all sorts of ways, right? It's also used to dispel people who might be wrongly convicted. So if you've got a person who has a strong likeness to somebody else, that's another way. So these are just 3 use cases, and we see so many more that we could talk about today.
Thanks. And Michael, obviously, when we talk about facial recognition in law enforcement, that's a huge topic. Your department's looking at this from a slightly different perspective. Can you talk about how CBP is looking at this in terms of border entry and other uses?
Sure. So our use case, like you said, is a little different than the one Mr. Reyes and Benji were describing. We have, like so many things that are involved with DHS and CBP, a lot of the things we do with biometrics stemmed from the 9/11 attacks. So after the 9/11 attacks occurred and the report came out a few years later, what was revealed was that many of the hijackers had come in and out of the United States in various identities, violating their status in multiple ways, and through a variety of document forging methods. And that revealed the need to bring biometrics into an immigration and border crossing and transportation kind of construct. And that, at the time, was very new. Until that time, really, biometrics were limited to fingerprints, maybe some face recognition, and it was also limited to a very strict law enforcement police type of work. And so bringing it into our world was very different and very new to a lot of people. But what we've seen with face recognition coming up is that we are really just trying to, in a more secure way and in a more facilitative way, answer the question of, are you who you say you are? So we're doing something a little different than looking for people that we think may have committed a crime. We're dealing with people that are asserting an identity and seeking access to another place, whether it's an airplane, whether it's entrance to the United States through the TSA checkpoint. And so those types of use cases are a little different, where someone is proactively saying, this is who I am, and the technology is used to back that up.
Hey, can you stay on that for a minute? Because I think this is one of the examples I think it's really important that, we understand that how much better the technology has become than a human at recognizing this, because we've already seen, I think, in some of the deployments, officers, thinking there's someone maybe they were suspicious of, but they couldn't actually definitively say this was a different person. But with the technology, it's coming up with a red alert telling them, you really need to take a second look here.
Yeah, I mean, this was really hard for us to sort of admit to ourselves. We have over 50,000 officers. We train them for many weeks and months on a variety of things, including looking at a document, looking at a person, seeing, does this person match this document? Do you turn the photo upside down? There's a variety of ways that they are taught to do that. But when you really come down to it, is that there are some things that machines are better at, and there's some things that people are better at. Right now, it's clear that machines are better at matching a photo to a person. And that's shown up in all of our research. That's not something that's been true for a long time. It's really, I think the technology has advanced to the point in the past 2 years, maybe less, where that's really true. But it's a huge advantage for us now, not just because the machine can perform better than the human in the actual matching, but also because it frees up the person to do other law enforcement activities in a small amount of time, which is all they have. That they can pull out maybe some information that they wouldn't have already otherwise had time for because they were doing some administrative task. So what the facial recognition has allowed us to do is free up the officer to ask that extra question, talk to the person, and see if there's something that they need to think about or just that strikes them wrong.
Yeah, Daniel, if I could just make a very close correlation to the fingerprint technology from the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, when I came on the job in 1989, if we collected a fingerprint from a crime scene, a evidence technician with a magnifying glass would sit there and manually compare that one fingerprint from a crime scene against thousands of records. Eventually, these guys were so good that they would make the connection, but it would take them weeks, sometimes months, to find that matching using the microscope. Then, of course, once the automated fingerprint identification system was introduced into our field, within seconds, that same fingerprint would be identifiable, and it didn't cause us to go and put handcuffs on a person. It just says, now take a look at this person, start investigating a little bit further. But it was clearly a better lead, a faster lead, than doing a naked eye search on millions of fingerprint records. So it's the same analogy,
Right.
how much we've come forward since then.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I think is so interesting about the technology is that, the way humans do facial recognition themselves, Eddie, if I saw you 2 weeks from now and you changed your hair color and shaved off your mustache, I wouldn't recognize you,
Right.
because that's, how humans recognize faces. And a computer is looking at it based on, the shape of your cheeks and maybe the shape of your, eyebrow arch or something else, that it's going to pick up those small details that individuals don't use. Maureen, I mean, one of the things I really like about National Police Foundation is you were really focused on thinking about the innovative tools to empower police officers and, help them do their jobs better. And so I know your organization's been looking at facial recognition technology and thinking about its role in policing. Can you give us your perspective?
Absolutely, and I won't go too far into the weeds because I have a feeling you're going there next in terms of responsible uses and how to get communities involved. But one of the things that we've seen that hasn't already been addressed on the panel is the use of technology like facial recognition to facilitate cooperation across jurisdictions. The reality is that most of our state and local law enforcement agencies in the U.S. are very small. So by integrating around regional intelligence centers and using facial recognition, they're actually able to coordinate a lot more easily on investigations that might cross jurisdictional lines. So we're excited to support that.
Great. And one thing, I'll open this up to anyone who wants to take it. It was briefly mentioned, but one of the uses is around child safety and helping locate children. Can anyone talk about this use? Because to me, that's one of the most important ones. I mean, we're seeing it as both an in-person and an offline use, and this is something that when I hear about some of these restrictions, I think that's really frustrating, because I think if you're a parent who's lost a child, you want everything available, out there, all the resources available being used to help solve this problem.
I'll take a shot at it, Dan, and just tell you that, for the many years that I was a law enforcement officer, I worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is located in Alexandria, Virginia, where I worked. And so the most common thing known for law enforcement and 911 is that the first 2 hours are the most critical 2 hours of a child recovery investigation. And the quicker that you get those photographs out, those images out, the greater your chances are of those 2 hours. Here in this region, in 2 hours, you can be in West Virginia, as an example. And so that's why it's so important to disseminate photographs, because those first 2 hours are so critical to recovering a child. And, using awesome tools that we have today, like the Amber Alerts and all the missing children alerts that we can push out photographs now, it's a lot faster and more efficient way of recovering children than back in the day when we would just put out a radio broadcast, say the child was last seen wearing a blue shirt and blue jeans. Now, 10 minutes ago, now they're wearing a white T-shirt and, shorts. Mm-hmm. And so that facial recognition is, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a video and a photo of a missing child is worth 10,000 words when it comes to rescuing a child.
And I'll go a step further. There's been a lot of research actually at DHS and some other interagencies at the federal level to look at how to take images from the dark web of sexually exploited children, which is one of the most deplorable situations. And you can take those images and match them and try to find out the identity of these children and the assailants. And that's another area that's very cutting edge. It's very new, but it's a promising use case.
Yeah. Michael, I didn't know if you wanted to comment on this, because I know CBP does have a role in helping, especially stop trafficking. I mean, that's one of the, it's not something everyone always is remembering, but, that's one of the things sometimes they're screening for. And I know we've seen, groups like Thorn, for example, talk about the use of facial recognition where, they're going to some of these sites where they're seeing trafficked women, for example, and, their point is they need the technology because the only time they have for intervention is maybe 45 minutes after an ad goes up, because that's the only period of time in which they're going to be successful in calling to make an appointment to go actually meet with a person to see if it's someone that they should be intervening with. Are you seeing any uses in this case even broadly at DHS?
I'd have to talk to DHS, see if they have it more broadly than we do, but we certainly are involved in combating human trafficking. We don't yet use the watch list kind of model for face recognition.
Mm-hmm.
We use it for fingerprints. But we haven't gotten to the point where we're using a watch list system just for face, such that if we had specific photographs, we could catch them at the time that we encounter them. We're working on that.
Yeah. Murray.
And so in my, I have to say I'm only a couple weeks at the Police Foundation, but in my prior role, I was at the National Institute of Justice, where I spent some time managing our human trafficking portfolio. So I appreciate this question because I feel like I actually have something substantive to say about it. But so one of the things that we saw too is that the value of facial recognition is actually maximized when you combine it with AI technology, which can scrub language. So obviously, like in the dark web, people aren't necessarily saying, hey, minor trafficking victim, for your pleasure, let's have a conversation about it. So the AI can actually stay in front of the evolution in language. So if you have facial recognition that recognizes that you have a victim, you apply the AI and they identify additional related ads through that one confirmed case of trafficking. So you're able to identify a lot more victims when you combine it with other emerging technologies.
That's a really great point. I mean, I went to a presentation recently with the president of Thorn, and she made that same point about how the natural language processing component of AI, because of the fact that when they interviewed many victims, they said one of the things they were forced to do was write their own ads, and the pictures weren't always their pictures, but it was always their own copy. Yep. And so, the fact that they could analyze that was incredibly powerful. I wanted to stay with you because you had, I want to talk about the policies that law enforcement should be using. As you mentioned, this is something that you've been working on. I know, Eddie, you've been working on this as well. I'd like to hear what you've come up with so far.
Well, so from, and Jim told this to me on his way to the elevator. So from the Police Foundation's perspective, obviously, and it's really no different than perspective on any type of evolving technology policy, but involvement of the community is key. As is transparent use. So a lot of the fears that you see around any type of technology use, that particularly technology that's new and unknown, is how it will be used. So if you have a transparent policy, if you communicate clearly with your jurisdiction, you eliminate some of that fear as long as you stick to that policy and are transparent in your operations. The second is the value of providing the community an opportunity to weigh in. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to actually implement their suggestions, but giving them a platform so that you can hear directly what their concerns are and integrate them to the best extent possible. I'm thinking about what we saw when drones first came out. And there were civil liberties groups that were actively opposed to the use of drones in any law enforcement capacity. But by bringing civil libertarians in the same room with law enforcement chiefs, you start to understand that there are certain gray areas where everybody can agree we can start to use the technology, things like accident reconstruction for drones, for example, and then just grow from there in a way that's reasonable for all parties involved.
Great, thanks. Eddie, I know you've also been working on this issue.
Yep. So I would like to offer 5 components that I think are very effective and beneficial for policy. One of them, the first and obviously the beginning, is the image capture. So that's where it all begins. The second component of policy is the image usage. So you have to build policy around how you're going to capture these images, then how you're going to use them. Then a third component of a policy should be the retention period. How long are you going to retain these records? Because at the end of the day, they are records like everything else. So image retention should be a significant component of whatever policy you're considering. Image accuracy, a fourth component of any policy should be to what level are you going to allow samples to come into a database of accuracy. And so having image accuracy is a very important one. And then the last one is human oversight, which is something that Maureen alluded to. So with any match, with any pointing of any image, it's still going to require some human intervention to do some further investigating of that lead. And then on top of that, you still are going to need executive management to ensure that policies, training, and practice are being followed. And so the oversight carries all the way to the executive level of the organization to ensure that even if you build all these components into your policy, that they're being practiced and they're exactly being followed.
So, yep, Michael.
Yes, I would just echo both Maureen and Eddie that there's a variety of concepts to follow, but the most important one is transparency. So as a federal agency, we're required to publish what we call privacy impact assessments. So when we roll out a new technology or a new process, we publish a whole set of explanations about why we're using the data, how we collect it, who we share it with, how long we keep it, everything that you would need to know. And that's very helpful when you go out and talk to people, because you can always say, here's where to find it. It's all right there. I don't need to recite it to you now. You don't need to write it down, because here's a place on the web where you can find everything we're doing with the face data. So that's really important. I think that also that sort of the transparency on the spot, in the sense. So what we do is we put signage up within airports. We're working on how to maybe communicate better beyond signage, but we put physical signs up any place we're collecting face recognition data, and so the person is never surprised, and there's never a surveillance type collection of a person. It's always, please stand in front of the camera, and we're taking your photo for this purpose, and here's why. So you have both those types of transparency. Really, really helps. And the others, to Eddie's point, were sort of what we call data minimization. Don't keep data longer than you need to, and explain exactly why you need to keep it for as long as you do, and have a good reason. And then the last thing is sort of like an internal integrity process about constantly be on the lookout for, are our match rates where they need to be? How can we get better? What algorithms are we using? Do we need to, all those things to go through and have constant vigilance in terms of your own performance. And when you have all those things together, I think it really helps with the public buy-in.
Thanks. I think CBP is kind of one of the clear models for how to do that transparency. I think anyone that's gone through any of those screening areas, the information's there. It's communicated to you. You can choose to ignore it, but at least it's there. I think it's harder probably for police in the community, because you're not kind of funneled through a line where the signs are just there. So I want to stay on the transparency point for a minute for on the kind of policing the community side. How are you guys thinking about doing that? Because that's always one of the critiques that you hear in any of the kind of local hearings. I didn't know that this was happening, or and I think it's a little bit of a red herring because I can't think of the last time I knew of something my local police department was doing anyway in terms of a technology upgrade. That's not something that's just kind of easily communicated. But how should law enforcement be actively communicating that, or how should they be working on those issues? Is it public forums? Is it something else? How are you guys thinking about solving that part of the problem?
So I'll hop in here. I mean, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all model. A lot of that already it depends on the existing relationships you have in your particular jurisdiction and how active your community is in sort of co-producing public safety. But one of the things that we've started to look at is there are certain cases where the public is completely unconcerned that you're using this, right? Like you think about the Boston Marathon investigation. There wasn't an outcry that private store video cameras were used in that investigation, right? So sort of starting from those places where everybody can agree this is an essential technology, and then just working them back to where they're most comfortable, and sort of pointing out the utility of it. I don't think that. No, I don't know of any law enforcement agency in the U.S. who's excited about facial recognition because they would like to institute some kind of draconian oversight of their citizens, right? Like having that honest dialogue to make sure that the people you're sworn to protect understand what it is you're doing and why is a really great starting point.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, the only thing I'll contribute to that is I think it's understandable why someone going through an airport or maybe even after a horrific bombing like in Boston, there's not going to be no outcry because when you fly through an airport, A, it's expected, and B, you want that level of security if you're going to be 30,000 feet above the air. No one has an issue with that. It's when cops are just walking down Main Street with their body-worn cameras on thinking that the police are capturing innocent citizens walking down the sidewalk, collecting all those images to be used later on to see what can I get this guy or this girl for. I think that's the big difference of why there's no outcry during those examples. And the outcry seemed to be for day-to-day routine collection where the person has not committed any kind of violation or is not expecting a very high level of security, for example. So I think those are the big key differences there.
Yeah. Benji.
Yeah, no, I can say from the industry perspective, one of the things we've been trying to do is work with organizations like IACP and IGIS and other police organizations to get the word out, because it's in the industry's interest, obviously, to make sure that the technology is accurate, it's high performing, and it's being used properly. So we work through those channels, and it's forums like this, it's getting out to conferences and making sure that, most importantly, the use cases are stressed, they're well understood, and then the benefits, the good news stories are also put out there, because right now it's a lot of negativity and a lot of hyperbole of things that could go wrong. But when you start to peel the onion back and ask, well, can you demonstrate what has gone wrong, the evidence gets a little thin.
Yeah, and I want to stick on, we mentioned a couple of these, and I want to make sure we do some myth dispelling here if possible. So one of the other critiques that we often hear is that someone will be arrested automatically by one of these facial recognition systems. Would it ever be appropriate for police to arrest someone based only on a match from a facial recognition program, and are there policies in place that would prevent that?
I can tell you from being a police officer and a police commander and leader, absolutely not is it ever permissible, or should it be permissible or appropriate to make an arrest just on the basis of facial recognition alerting. There should be additional, with any arrest that a law enforcement officer makes in America, it's got to have the most basic element, that is probable cause. And a probable cause does not exist. All the facial recognition could tell you all it wants. You still need to develop probable cause. So that needs to be built into that.
Can I ask a quick question about that? And I apologize that I don't know the answer to this, but how is the case law developing around that? To what extent does a confirmed match on a piece of technology constitute probable cause, or how close does it get you? Do we know?
I've been out of the game for 3 years now, so I can't tell you.
So I can answer some of that question.
Okay.
I don't know about the probable cause piece, but I know from an evidentiary perspective, it cannot be used in a court of law to convict somebody on its own. It can be used in conjunction with other evidence, but it does not meet the Frye and Dobert standards yet for that piece. So, and that's work that's being done. The standards are being created around that to get to that point. There have been a few cases where it's been used, but I don't think it's anything earth-shattering yet.
Okay.
Daniel, and if I might just add, as a representative of a committee of the IACP and as a leader of that committee, I can tell you I traveled the United States extensively to some of the 16,000 law enforcement agencies across America, and the majority of law enforcement agencies have no issue with some of the regulations we're talking about. They want a well-regulated program. No legitimate law enforcement agency wants a rogue officer that can do anything that they want whenever they want and just put handcuffs on someone just on a facial recognition alert. No one wants that in a legitimate law enforcement agency.
Yeah, and again, to double down on that, I mean, if we go back, this echoes some of your introductory remarks, right? If you go back 150 years and you look at the beginning of the origins of fingerprints, right? We heard the same pushback, right? Dragnets, loss of anonymity, things like that. And then in the 2000s, same thing with DNA. It was the same debates, and so now we're just sort of going back through that same, those same issues with facial recognition.
You forgot one, Benji, license plate readers.
There you go. That's right. That's another one. Yeah.
But I think that a lot of this revolves. This is what I call the Times Square scenario. So, the Times Square scenario is something that I've just made up, but it's essentially, if you imagine you have Times Square in New York City, There's millions of people go through there every year, every day. They want Broadway tickets. They want to go to the Disney store. They want to just look at the buildings, whatever. And the scenario is the NYPD puts up a bunch of cameras around there, and they wait for a criminal to walk in front of one of the cameras, and then they leap out from behind the dumpster from where they're hiding and take down the criminal. That's the use case that a lot of the fear sort of tries to fit anything real into that. Right? So anything where facial recognition is used, they're going to say, well, that's an inevitable jump to what the Times Square scenario ultimately is, which is a dragnet type of society where someone gets arrested solely on facial recognition, and there's cameras in the sky, and the matching occurs instantaneously and perfectly, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that we, need to define the use cases and show how they're different, and also push back a little on some of the fear mongering on face recognition, and delineate between what's a real program and what's sort of made up.
Thanks. So another question I wanted to ask, in terms of the critiques that we hear, is around political surveillance, or police using facial recognition to continue or expand surveillance of protesters or others in this. Others might be engaged in that activity. I wanted to ask if basically what your reaction to that is, because I think often what we see in this debate is sometimes people conflating different arguments. So there might be legitimate objections to surveillance of a certain activity, whether or not facial recognition is used maybe is incidental. But I wanted to open that question up to the panel.
Yeah, I can start with one angle of that, and that is, having worked many civil disturbance incidents, here in the National Capital Region, I can tell you that many times, so here's a myth to be broken, when, the public sees that a law enforcement official is running video of a, civil, protest type of event, or even just a demonstration, a lawful demonstration, the connotation there is that, well, they're doing this to, punish people that are here pro or against whatever the issue is. And the reality is that they're there to record, because a lot of these outbreaks, end up violent, and so you need to know who did what in the melee. And so that's one of the reasons that video is taken. But oftentimes there's civil litigation that comes up against the law enforcement agencies, against excessive force or things of that nature. And the only way you can demonstrate that these officers either did or did not use excessive force is through the use of government-operated video. But it's mostly to monitor violence in the crowd, behavior of the officer. It's the ones I've been involved in have never been related to any kind of political monitoring. So I don't think it's appropriate for it to be used for that reason, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that issue, too, is messaging the role of law enforcement at what starts out as a peaceful protest. Law enforcement isn't there because they hope it gets violent, and that they don't use facial recognition because they hope they get to arrest people, right? They're there to protect people's First Amendment rights to free speech. And they're appropriately trained to do everything they can to de-escalate violence and to keep something that's just a natural protected convening from escalating into violence. So I think whenever we talk about facial recognition in the civil disturbance arena, we also have to talk about the role of law enforcement to prevent that facial recognition from being used in any type of arrest power way, because we hope that doesn't happen in the first place.
Great, thank you. Benji, I want to turn to you and Michael as well for the next question. One of the objections we also hear a lot about is about the disparities in performance for some systems around racial and gender lines. And this is both on the one-to-many matching and one-to-one matching. That's obviously a question you get a lot. I'd just like to hear kind of what you're thinking about in terms of industry, how it's changing, and what law enforcement need to know about that issue.
Yeah, so no, it's a great question, and we take it very seriously. The civil liberties aspect has been in the news a lot, and so from an accuracy perspective and performance of the algorithms, you mentioned 2 years. I'll go a little further. Maybe the last 5 years, what we've seen is dramatic increases in the accuracy of the technology, and in instances where NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has tested the technology, we're seeing error rates as low as 1%. And for the high-performing algorithms, it's less than that. We're talking about 0.3%, okay? And we're talking 12 million faces in these tests. So very, very large data sets. And, we do understand that it's never 100%. And that's why we spend millions of dollars a year to keep fixing the algorithms and make them much better. You know, one of the great stats I always like to throw out is NIST tested 4 algorithms in the late 90s. Well, last year they tested 150, over 150. So we're talking dramatic increase in competition, which always drives better products, better technology, and we're really proud to participate in those tests. Another good test that's done is by DHS S&T. And one of the great things you have to remember is, you know, the algorithms themselves are only one part of a larger solution. There's also the camera on the front end, whether it's a video camera or a still camera collecting those images. So if you have a poor optical sensor, you're going to get some poor images, and that can affect the ability to match those images. So what we always fall back on is you don't want to be listening to me talk about how accurate my stuff is. You want to listen to NIST. You want to listen to DHS S&T because they're focusing on these ethnicity scores now. And they're going to be publishing, and they already have in some instances. We've seen data come out that shows how well certain algorithms perform, how well certain systems perform, and that work is really critical because those are unbiased resources, scientists who are coming up with this great data to show. And then what that means practically for police organizations is they now have a place to go and say, okay, if I'm going to buy this technology, what are the vendors that are responsible? Which ones do spend a lot of money on R&D and perform well in these tests? And that's really important.
Yeah, we are partners with NIST. We wrote them a big check. That's how it works. It's not bribery. But you know, we gave them, you know, money to help us learn more about this and ensure how this data, you know, is working on our own. We've done some internal studies that are not perfect because CBP doesn't collect data on race. So other than looking at photos one at a time, I couldn't go through any of our databases and tell you what race anybody is. We've looked at particular flights that have boarded biometrically. So in other words, instead of a boarding pass, they board with their face. And we've tried looking at flights that go to different parts of the world and seeing is there any differentiation in performance. We haven't really found anything consistent in any particular direction. But that doesn't mean that we don't take this seriously, that we aren't still looking at it seriously. The other thing is the use cases really matter. So, you know, in some cases, in our case for CBP, the person as asserting an identity they want to match, right? That's what they're looking to do. In maybe a more straight criminal or police investigation, they probably don't want to match. So whatever the differentiation in performance is in one use case, it's going to be the opposite concern in a different use case. And I think that's something to think about and consider. So I don't think that it's always the same in every, as it's portrayed, which is face recognition is always bad in all circumstances the same way. It's not. It can't be.
Yeah. Eddie, did you have?
I was just going to say that, you know, to Benji's point of a 1% error rate in today's technology for photo recognition, you know, that's a significant advancement compared to, as I say, going back to the 90s when I was starting police work, where it was always eyewitness identification on the side of the road or looking at a photo spread. I myself had to do a photo spread as a police officer of 6 pictures in front of me on a robbery that I had interrupted. And when the detective showed me the photo spread, and at that point I'd been on the job 7 or 8 years, so I had some experience. And when I saw the photo spread of 6 pictures in front of me, I literally did this, and I said, give me a minute, because it wasn't obvious to me who the guy was that I had witnessed robbing a person on the side of the road. Whereas today's photo recognition technology really is like the cameras in our phones. You know, the flip phone cameras were grainy, granular, really poor quality. Today's, you know, latest model photograph is much better than a 35 millimeter camera 5 years ago. So technology just continues to advance and make the algorithms and the identification of photos a lot more precise than it used to be back in the past.
And that's one of the important, you bring up a really important point about, you know, it works better than the human being, right? Especially people who might be tired. You know, in most cases, if you're not a trained expert and you're trying to make an identification as a human being with no help, it's a coin toss, 50-50.
And you could potentially send the wrong person to prison for the rest of their life.
That's right. And with training, it gets better, but it's never never above 80%, right?
Yeah, one of the things I think is really interesting to your point is that, how we talk about these numbers in terms of accuracy are often being misconstrued, I think, in a lot of the reporting that I'm seeing about this. So, for example, you might see something about someone saying, the system is 10%, 10 times less accurate, but we're talking about 0.1% error and 1% error.
That's right.
And what's lost there is, what's the error rate for humans, and how does that compare? And also, what's the error rate for the fingerprint systems, which is, the ones I saw before were around 2%. So, they were significantly higher, and the comparisons here aren't always clear. I think one thing that's also left out, and Benji, one thing that I want you to talk about a little bit more, is you talked about the innovation in this space, and I think some people have been kind of implying that maybe people weren't innovating as much over the last few years. And what I think is lost is that there were a lot of really hard problems to solve along the way. So, if you go back, maybe I think it was maybe 8 or 10 years ago, there was a focus on, NIST was looking, I think they called it the good, bad, and ugly. So, it was the idea when you have these photos in the wild that they're off-centered or they're fuzzy, you still want to use them. How can we improve the systems that way? Because for a while, the systems are really good if you had those kind of perfect photos, and the older algorithms could do that. And the question is, well, how can we fix that issue? And they spent a lot of time. You guys spent so much time working on that issue. And so, we still have some other things to resolve, but you spent a lot of time working on some really hard problems.
Yeah, no, you're right. And what we've seen and what we hear from NIST is that every 2 years, the error rates are cut in half recently. And a lot of that has to do with convolutional neural networks and artificial intelligence and just larger data that is out there to be trained against. So, but you're absolutely right. In the early days of facial recognition, the original use cases had to do with deduplication of driver's licenses or mugshot sort of approaches, or passport images. And those are all really high quality images, right? You're required to hand in a nice quality image for your passport or your driver's license. So those are fairly easy to use. But over time, when you saw the proliferation of different types of sensors for video cameras and so forth, we did get these faces in the wild. And so for the first, I'll use the last 20 years as a marker. For the first 10 years, we all focused on how do we get faster and more accurate with those mugshots or passport databases. And then over time, we started to shift the research dollars towards the off-angle, the occluded faces, the pixelated faces, the low, where there might be shadows. That's where a lot of the money has gone over the past 10 years, and it's really paid off because, you see advances in things like the iPhone, where it can deal with those images. And they don't have the same color backgrounds, right? There's lots of noise in the background that throws the algorithm off, or the older ones, right? And so the newer ones are able to see past all that noise and make matches.
Yeah, and this is something we've seen too. I mean, if you look at the two main environments we use facial recognition, one is like inside the inspection service where CBP officers are inspecting incoming travelers to the United States. There's no windows, the cameras don't move. The people are all in a line and come up in an orderly way to talk to the officer. That's one environment. And the second one we're looking at now is people boarding flights. That's a lot different. There's a lot of people going around. There's sometimes it's night and sometimes it's day, and there's reflected glass, and there's a lot of windows inside. There's a lot of people wear hats and sunglasses even to board the plane. So there's a lot of differentiation in the type of environment in which we try to use this technology. We haven't seen a huge difference in the performance. There's some, but generally it's still pretty good. So I think a lot of that research has paid off.
So I want to turn to the fact that there's been bans in 3 cities. San Francisco, Somerville, and Oakland, I think, was the last one to do a ban on government or police use of facial recognition. From Marie, let me start with you. I mean, what do you see as the risk of these types of bans? How are you kind of advising your community on this?
So one of the things we're actually trying to do is get out in front in communities where a ban might be coming and have that type of conversation that I was talking about earlier. We have a new initiative where it's called Building Digital Trust. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, is have that frank discussion, because we think some of these bans might be built on a fundamental misunderstanding of technological capabilities and their intended uses. And it could actually be solved in a very frank town hall model, as opposed to a sort of reactive, unnecessarily restrictive legislation.
Yeah,
I bet 100% or more.
Yeah, and and we said this in the San Francisco ban. If you read that ban, it's really unfortunate because it just uses one use case, video surveillance, and it paints the whole facial recognition technology industry as a video surveillance technology.
Right, it's Times Square.
And we've forgotten, it's Times Square, and we've forgotten every other use case we've talked about up here.
The only thing I was going to add to that, Dan, it's kind of, if you remember back in the early 90s, during the Rodney King incident, when the police officers there were using the side handle batons, and every city manager and every mayor in America immediately got on the phone with their police chief and says, are we carrying side handle batons? Get rid of them immediately. Because one bad use, painted a horrific picture for American law enforcement during that one incident. And unfortunately, this is the knee-jerk reaction that I'm witnessing. I mean, let's face it, being a cop in one of those three cities is tough anyway, even besides this ban. Yeah. But it's just, going back to the town hall meetings, if you get ahead, and I don't know what their deployment was, but if you get ahead of the deployment with some positive, proactive community outreach, it's going to prevent a lot of this. When we deployed the body-worn camera program in Alexandria, Virginia, I was at the head of that, and we had multiple town hall meetings at almost every school in the city, well ahead of our deployment. We were just in the planning phases then, but before, and a lot of the feedback that we got from the community during our planning phase was what we used for our policy. And then when we deployed it, everyone was totally comfortable with body-worn cameras because we had been out there months before we actually deployed the cameras.
And let me ask you, because I think what's interesting, at least in some of these cities, these bans are happening before the technology was even being considered by law enforcement, which means sometimes those police agencies weren't even in the position to necessarily have those town halls or have those conversations and even say, this is what we're doing or explain, because they're maybe still in that learning mode themselves of trying to find out. How do you, maybe I'll start with Benji, because you're in the business of trying to get this out there. I mean, how do you operate in that kind of environment where there's this, kind of reactionary force to say, we don't want this technology before people even had a chance to, kick the tires and try it out and even just see it for once and see maybe they like it,
No, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, I've already mentioned we work with the IACP and some of the other organizations, but look, I get phone calls. I teach at George Mason, right? And some of the students I teach go on to be police officers. They literally call me and say, I want to stand up this program. What do I do? And they look for data, and we send them to the IACP document or the BJA document on policy. There's documents out there that say if you're going to stand up a facial recognition program, here's some templates that you can use. You just lift those and put your police officer, your police organization's name on it, and then move it forward. But some of the things we've mentioned, we educate, right? So when we talk to our teams that go and engage with these police forces, or even with CBP or at the federal level, we always make sure that there's an understanding of policy, at least on some level, and privacy, to tell them, even though it's not our responsibility, we understand that there is a PIA that has to be done in most instances. There needs to be some sort of policy put in place, and training as well. We also provide some level of training on how to use the technology. Also auditing and traceability. So those are some of the things we use when we go in and talk to some of the police officers.
Yeah, and so some of the things that we try to do are we try to illustrate not just the security benefits of the technology, but the facilitative benefits of the technology. So when we partner with an airline or an airport, we really send the message like, this is going to make you both more secure, and it's going to make you have an easier time to the airport at the same time. So what our vision is that someone can arrive at an airport for an international flight, and they can go all the way through the airport and never pull a document out of their pocket. Their face is their passport, their face is a boarding pass. And that's possible to do today. And that kind of ban would say, like, well, you can't do that. I think doesn't resonate with people very well once you can explain a clear benefit to them that's maybe even above and beyond the security benefit that they can understand a little better.
And I want to broaden this conversation, Maureen, just to this idea of technological innovation in general, because I think ideally what you'd want to see is a lot of different police departments piloting different technologies all the time. And in fact, one of the challenges that I think some police departments have had with facial recognition technology when they've tried it is that they've recognized they're so far behind on other technology that deploying this one's hard. And I mean, so ideally what you'd want to see is, good IT systems, throughout these agencies so that, whatever they're doing it more efficiently, that their communications programs are working better, that they're able to receive calls and provide information to the public better, faster, cheaper. How do we just get more innovation in general in police departments? How do we enable that?
So a couple of things, and one, I would say looking towards the federal support and demanding appropriations for federal support to state and local law enforcement to procure the technology that they need. A lot of the stuff is, at this point, prohibitively expensive, and we do have organizations at the Department of Justice, like the Bureau of Justice Assistance, who are well poised to provide police departments with the basic minimum necessities of having an evolved technology program. And then the second is looking at regional networks, which is what I spoke about at the very beginning. So many of our agencies are fairly small and with limited budgets. And the more that we can facilitate not only technology development, but information sharing and coordination across jurisdictions, the better position they'll be to support more expensive and long-term technological solutions.
Yeah.
I'll just mention real quick from an industry perspective, we've had to innovate and come up with new technologies that are in the cloud and that are more nimble and at a better price point to meet some of that demand.
Yeah, and Eddie, you sit now in two different agencies, and you've seen, I'm sure, this issue play out also in just some of the other cities that you have colleagues in. How do how do your peers think about that issue of innovation, technological innovation, and the challenges? I mean, it's obviously a challenge in government in general, but I think it's a challenge more so in certain types of agencies that, maybe that's not necessarily what they're focused on. Sometimes they don't have the resources assigned to do that. And I think in policing, just based on some of the other work we've done, that seems to be a consistent theme.
Yeah, and with cops, there's only two things that they hate: the way things are and changing. And so I can tell you from 30 years on the job that I've gone through many policy iterations, and we hated what we were going to until that started failing, and then we couldn't wait to go backwards to the previous technology. But exactly like Maureen said, I mean, this technology is prohibitively expensive for smaller agencies, and as we know, 80% of law enforcement in America are 25 officers or less. And for an agency like that, deploying this kind of technology would be very difficult compared to your New York, your NYPDs and your LAPDs and things along those lines. But I think it's like anything else. It's prohibitively expensive until you get served with a $1 million lawsuit because a serial rapist went undetected for 3 or 4 years, and he came under the radar of many law enforcement agencies. He should have been caught. He could have been caught, but for not deploying technology. And then all of a sudden, a $500,000, body-worn camera or image photo recognition technology becomes immediately attainable when you're served with a $1 million lawsuit for failing to act. So that's one way to look at not deploying and not leaping out there and getting into the technology game.
Yeah. So, in terms of, policymakers like to, especially local officials, I think sometimes they're going to the ban because that's the thing they know how to do. And so I think a lot of them are also looking for alternatives because they say, I've had some constituents call up about this issue. I need to do something, and I need to do something more than maybe a town hall. Are things like performance standards something that should be looked to? I mean, one of the things that I think, again, CBP is kind of a role model here is you guys have consistently used kind of the best technology available by looking to those standards. And so you've never really had that issue. But at the local level, I mean, we do see local governments sometimes make bad procurement decisions. So there's sometimes the issue of, well, federal government gives them money, but then are you going to get the best technology? If you were, Maureen, to see the federal government give more money, would you like to see performance standards tied to it? Would you like to see some conditions on that funding, or do you think it should just be an open market?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think the thing that's striking me about this conversation is none of this is unique to facial recognition technology, right? We have the exact same discussion about a host of other technologies, or even just protective equipment for law enforcement. And you go to a conference like the IACP annual conference, and there's a massive exhibit hall with hundreds and hundreds of vendors, and no guidance for law enforcement about what is the most appropriate technology to solve their problem. So to the extent that we could develop those, If only we knew of a national policing organization who was at this table who would be well positioned to develop that for the entire nation. But no, it's sorely needed, and it's a point well taken.
Yeah, I think I know who you're alluding to. But doesn't FBIC just sort of offer a service that local can use?
They do, but it's not comprehensive, and at the pace that technology evolves, it only sort of starts to scratch at the surface. Yeah.
So solve her problem.
I'll work on that. Yeah.
But one thing that is striking to me is even when we're talking about performance standards, of course, to Eddie, your point earlier, I mean, there's no performance standards on the humans that would be doing the exact same job. And so I think that's one of the struggles in this conversation is it's easy to say, well, we're going to demand, this performance standard, but should we be tying that to what's out there now? I mean, should the point of innovation to be doing better than, an arbitrary standard should be to do better than what we have today?
Yeah, I mean, we get this all the time, which is they want to compare what we're doing against some perfect status quo, which doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, well, the technology only matches at 99%. Okay, well, humans match at much less than 99%. I mean, there's an imagined perfect status quo, and that we're deviating from that. Then it's just not a real life. Human beings can be biased. Human beings make mistakes. Human beings get tired. Face recognition can do some things better, but some things probably maybe too much. But in general, focus on what machines can do better, let machines do, and what people can do better, let people do. That's sort of how we're approaching it.
Great. Daniel, and I can just tell you that, from having traveled to many law enforcement agencies across America, most are either double or triple digit understaffed. And so most law enforcement agencies are already maxed to their potential on capacity. And so when you match that up against, let's say, a serial burglar or a serial rapist in the community, all of a sudden that time pressure starts to compound against the barking dog complaints and the alarm call complaints. And so, at some point, technology has to cover that gap of, human capacity that right now is just maxed out across American law enforcement.
And please.
Sorry, I just want to add, just get this thought in. The notion that we should just stop doing everything just strikes me as really kind of naive in the sense that the whole world is moving to a more digital economy, a more digital system, a more digital life. So just in our environment, which is international travel and borders, right now the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is the UN group that does passport standards, they're working on a digital travel credential. So by 21 or 22, they're going to, passports will be issued digitally and maybe not on paper. There's going to be a lot of these kind of changes, and the idea that you can sort of put the genie back in the bottle is not realistic. I think what would be a lot better, and what I would appreciate a lot more from some of these groups that make a lot of noise is come to the table. I want to work with you to see how can we do this in the most privacy conscious way possible. But the idea that you want to just sort of lay across the railroad tracks, I just don't think that's really productive or useful to anyone.
Yeah. So,
and can I just say, Daniel, coming to the table, I think is a good opportunity to introduce a one-page document that the task force is working on. Benji's been alluding to a task force that's comprised of members of the IACP and the IGIS, and Catherine Miller's here that's got some copies of this one-page document that really is a one-page starter for law enforcement agencies looking at photo recognition technology and the best practices to consider.
Yeah. So I want to open it up to questions. I just want to address two more points before we do, but so please get your kind of questions ready. One is just kind of as we're talking about moving forward, we talked a lot about the the algorithms that are doing the matching, but as been mentioned a number of times, this is a whole system. It's the photos and it's the cameras. It's all of those pieces go together to build a functioning system. What do policymakers need to understand about the support for those components? Do law enforcement need funding for better cameras? Do we need funding for better statewide and national databases in this space? What's your message to lawmakers on that issue?
So I'll start with that. So one of the things we often say to staffers and members is back to the question of performance, and we always specify NIST. Mm-hmm. If you want to understand how the algorithms are working, take a look at the NIST report. You understand how the ethnicity of an individual has an impact, take a look at the NIST scores. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I keep referencing DHS&T. They just published a nice report that talks about the whole system. And they have a field test they do annually now, where they actually take the system, they take all the vendors and they partition them off, and they can't touch the systems, and they have people go through and touch those systems and say, how well does it work? How's the throughput? How do all these factors stack up? And then there's a report published, and then that's good data. So we recommend to the policymakers, take a look at what these folks are doing, and if you want to create rules around how to buy and procure, look to those organizations to guide it.
Yeah, and one thing I think that we need to do, groups like at this table, is be able to sort of translate NIST stuff a little better to a general.
Exactly.
They write stuff at the PhD level.
Right.
I can't. I'm reasonably well educated. I can't get past page 1 of any of their documents. I have to have someone translate it.
Executive summary.
So I literally will give it to somebody to say, like, tell me what this says, because they are incredibly brilliant, and they're incredibly, like you say, unbelievably good at this stuff. But it's hard, I think, sometimes to translate that into something that people can really understand. And I think that's something we've got to do better, and probably all of us do.
That's why, Michael, we always prepare a one-page
That's
summary for elected officials and decision makers, because you got to be prepared for that 5-minute elevator speech. And anything more than this, they're not going to read.
And Eddie, for those that are watching online, is that available online to download?
I don't know. Is it available yet, Catherine, or is it still in draft format?
The use case is available, but yes, we're looking to put the one-pager document available, whether it's on the IGES Institute site or the IECP Technology Center site.
We just had a meeting on this document this week at the Search Consortium, and we're trying to finalize it. But it's here for draft review.
Great. And so the last question I wanted to make sure we address before I open it up was around confidence thresholds that are used with these systems, because time and again, a number of the critiques that you see about these systems is that they'll have high error rates. And what is, I think, frustrating when you dig into some of the studies that will make these claims, whether it's an academic study or kind of a performance evaluation, is that they're not transparent necessarily about the confidence threshold they've used. And so for any system, when you're matching something, you're getting back some kind of rating about how assured this is. Just recently, for example, this week there was a lot of headlines about a study that came out of a review of the London police and their trial of a facial recognition system, and the claim was made that there were only 20% accurate matches in the field in this trial. And, as a headline, that's pretty damning for the technology. When you actually go in and read the, 250-page report, you see that they were using a 0.56 confidence threshold, which, suggests that, yes, you are going to have a lot of errors by definition of how you've set up the system. So that's actually not surprising. That's just indicative of how you set up your system. And so how do we, one, I kind of a two-part question. One, I just like some reactions in terms of how you're, maybe Benji, how you're talking to law enforcement about this key operational issue. And then two, how do we actually make sure that law enforcement are using the technology appropriately, so nobody is using the technology maybe at the wrong levels and not understanding the implications of that?
So two things. Michael's right. Translating the false non-match rates, and there is a lot of technical talk there. Not everybody is a statistician, right? So I think that's number one. That's important. And what we do when we talk to these organizations is we try to boil it down to 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 won't match properly, right? And then it's incumbent upon the organization to have policies in place to say, okay, what do we do when that happens, right? It's not that they get arrested, it's that it's maybe just a false match. And so how do you deal with that? We have those discussions, right? So that's the first thing. And just continuing to walk down this path of educating people. I will say, there was an article I read the other day where the journalists are beginning to get better at understanding the main issues. It's taken a while, but I do see more depth. They're citing the right people. They're citing people like Patrick Rother, from NIST, right? And they're translating it better, right? To get past all of the scientific jargon into what does it really mean on the streets, and that's important to do. And you know, your point about this whole point we're having here about digging into those reports, I've read some of the ones that are pretty harsh, and it does come down to preferential creation of the testing methodology. There's a way to do it where you can, and I want to stop shy of saying people are falsifying, but it does sort of cook the books in a way, right? You can say, like, if you set it at 80% and you get poor matches, well, we don't recommend that. Every time we go into a police organization or talk to CBP or DHS, we're saying 97, 98, 99%. So there's some work to be done around that.
Yeah, so there's one in particular, I'm not going to say who did this, what organization did it, but they did a particular study on Amazon recognition. So, and some of you may have read about it. So what they did was they bought Amazon recognition, took it out of the box, essentially, and matched criminal mugshot data against members of Congress. And they didn't change the threshold setting from the default setting that it sort of arrives with. And then, of course, and it was very low. So, of course, they had a bunch of mugshots matched to members of Congress, which is a very effective talking point if you're from them. Now, what they really did here was the equivalent of if I went to the store and I bought a frozen pizza, and I brought the frozen pizza home, and the frozen pizza box instructions say, cook it at 350 degrees for 10 minutes. And I go over to the oven and I cook it for 450 degrees for 20 minutes. And then the pizza burns, and I say, well, look, the oven doesn't work. Oven doesn't work. Look, the pizza's burned. What more evidence do you need? That's the exact same thing of what this group did with Amazon recognition. They took a product, they used it in a way that was not designed to be used per the instructions that Amazon gave. I'm not trying to shill for Amazon here. That's the group that came up. They used it in a way that wasn't designed to be used and then claimed it didn't work. And so those are the kinds of I think things that we're constantly going to have to push back on, because Patrick has his very choice words of that particular study that he's shared with me. But those are things we're going to have to deal with, because people again have an agenda in making the technology look bad.
So we'll open it up. We have a mic that will come around. If you can just say your name and organization, and then we'll take some questions. Also, again, if you're online and you'd like to submit a question, or if you're in the room and don't want to raise your hand, you're also welcome to use our hashtag ITIF facial recognition. Here we go.
Thanks. Hi, Jared Munchline from RAND Corporation. So one of the things we've noticed is that the Department of Defense has had some significant issues working with technology companies, Silicon Valley companies, on their photo recognition technologies, and they've had problems trying to acquire them. I'm curious if the organizations that you've worked with have also had issues with the technology firms in trying to get the right staffing to help support the technologies, or even just to perform R&D or to go through with the acquisitions.
Can you be a little bit more specific on the nature of the problem? They're not getting the support they need? Is that the...
So for example, with Google and Project Maven, right, you had a certain group of people like Google sign a petition to try to withdraw Google support from working on Pentagon projects.
Right. So I'll take it since I'm already talking. But I think it depends on the company, right, and those people inside the company, right? I mean, we are more of a traditional player in this space, I would say, right? We've been in this business for a very long time, for 40 years. And so that's sort of in our DNA to do public safety and work with federal government agencies. And so we haven't seen that. And a lot of our what we would consider near peer competitors, they're very similar. They've been working with DoD or with the Intel community or with DHS, and so it's just what we do. So we have not seen much of that, although I could see where that might be an issue.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? I don't know. Is that
yes,
allowed?
please.
Okay. So one of the things that we've seen in the law enforcement space is that when technology is developed for the Department of Defense or using DoD funds, obviously there's a lot more money in there.
Yeah.
And adapting technology for law enforcement is not necessarily a lucrative venture for tech companies. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, no, it's so I actually came from the Pentagon. I used to work there. I was a contractor, but I worked there for 7 years during the wars, and I call it's like it's almost like the Silicon Valley effect, right? Because after World War II, there was a ton of investment that went into various programs, and we see the same thing for biometrics. Whether everybody knows it or not, we've all benefited from the funding that went into biometrics in the wake of 9/11. All that the GWAT funding that was put in there, the Pentagon spent billions of dollars on R&D for all these modalities: fingerprint, face, iris, and it shows, right? And then that was in the 2000s. But then the thing that really changed, and again, I still think law enforcement benefits from this, is the private sector woke up. When Apple put facial recognition on the phone, and you start to see facial recognition show up in airports, you see the things that Delta's doing. It's like a hockey stick, right? I mean, it's taken off, and so, and I also see the technology getting better, faster, cheaper. The price points are going to change, and this issue that we see with law enforcement not having access to it because of the price points, that's going to change. That's going to change. Good.
Other questions? In the back, yes.
So OMB just put out an RFI on AI and data usage. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with it, but part of it can be summarized in what data is the public interested in getting their hands on from the government. Do you think down the line, as more programs are stood up, that facial recognition data could be one of these data sets? And also, the other part of the RFI is what kind of safeguards would you put in terms of, should it be a safe ground in which you can't actually access the data, but you can run your module on the data in the safe space? So I'm just curious if you have any submissions or comments on that.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's huge, right? It's a 21st century problem, data. It's going to drive all this AI innovation. I won't lie. I mean, we as a tech company, we need it. We want it. But we choose not to for privacy reasons, and we're also prevented from using it, right? And so I think coming up with a way to allow companies to have access to that data where it's anonymized, it's secure and safe, and it's safeguarded, and companies can train against those data sets to improve their technology, it's going to be helpful. That's going to drive innovation. That's one of the primary reasons that we're in a little bit of an arms race with China right now, because they have over 1 billion citizens, and their face data is not sacred. It's not private, right? And so those companies have access to that data, and it's a real concern. And it's not just facial recognition. We're going to see it in other areas of our economy where artificial intelligence engines are going to want to run against data sets that are protected by the 1974 Privacy Act and other acts that may come down the line, and that's a challenge.
Benjamin, to that point, earlier this week when we were at the Search Consortium meeting with IGES and the ICP folks around the table, unfortunately, it's programs like the ones you just described in China that give our programs here domestically.
Right, exactly.
That happens to us all the time.
When 60 Minutes puts a 15-minute segment on China's facial recognition program, and like, see, this is why we need to ban facial recognition in the United States, because they see that and they say that's what we're doing here, and there's no tidal wave following that to break down that huge myth.
And there's no correlation to how we use it here.
Right.
So,
Can I ask how many times you've looked to China for their policing policies and strategies?
We've hosted them a bunch of times here, but I've never known of an agency going there.
I'll just respond also to your question, because from my other hat as the director of our Center for Data Innovation, we've looked a lot at that problem, and I mean we've called on NIST to think about its role as a data provider too, not just in terms of testing. Especially when we're talking about some of these specific problems, like if you're talking about gender or racial disparities in performance, we think that's an opportunity for government to get involved and to make data sets available. Not necessarily data sets that we're not necessarily saying take the passport photos, for example, and make that available, but just like we have the 1 million Genome Project and other types of projects where the government's recruiting volunteers to provide data for specific purposes, we'd like to see government do more of that in some of these areas where we think there's a really valuable role to have inclusive, complete data sets. Other questions? Yes.
Chelsea Han, Google Public Policy Fellow. So I researched the applications of AI to predict and prevent gun violence and gang violence in schools. So from your perspective, how can we enhance the role of facial recognition in protective intelligence activities on potential gun shooters in schools? And what are your thoughts about potential limitations of using facial recognition in protective intelligence?
Yeah, it's tough because the privacy limitations of police officers going out on Facebook and taking an image of a potential gang member and trying to do some network analysis, it gets sticky real quick.
It also, I think, part of the limitation too is a lack of understanding from a scientifically rigorous perspective about what actually works in an intervention. So if you do identify somebody beforehand, knowing the best way to actually de-radicalize someone from violence is questionable. So you might have a self-fulfilling prophecy situation.
Great. I just want to give one last opportunity if there's any other questions. Great. Otherwise, please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent contributions today.